Abigail felt her legs give way, finally allowing her body to collapse at the edge of the dusty Kansas road. She had been walking since dawn, carrying a single, battered suitcase with everything she owned. Her employer in the railroad town had been clear. After discovering fabric scraps were missing, he wanted her gone. It didn't matter that she had never taken anything that wasn't hers. The accusation was made, and in this small, unforgiving territory, a man's word was law. That's when she heard the sound of hooves and creaking wheels on the dry earth. Abigail looked up, her eyes weary, to see a wagon approaching. The man driving it wore a wide-brimmed hat, his face etched with sun and shadow. Behind him, 5 small girls huddled together, their curious eyes fixed on her. He pulled the reins, stopping just feet away. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low. "Just tired," Abigail managed, trying to rise with dignity. "I'm looking for work." The man studied her, his gaze moving from her worn-out boots to her suitcase. He looked back at his daughters, then at her again, a silent, heavy decision being made. "My name is Thomas. I have a ranch nearby. And I have a proposal for you. You need a roof, and I need a mother for my daughters. Come with me. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching this story from. I'd love to know how far these exciting stories are reaching. And if you've ever experienced an inexplicable situation, share it with us." Only 48 hours earlier, Abigail had been secure. She was the best seamstress in the small but growing railroad town of Baxter Springs. Her life was not easy, but it was predictable. She lived in a small room above the general store, attached to the mercantile run by Mr. and Mrs. Davies. Mrs. Davies was a portly woman with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, always counting inventory, always suspicious of the hired help. Abigail's days were spent hunched over a heavy treadle machine, her fingers nimble and sure, turning bolts of calico and wool into sturdy shirts for the railroad men and serviceable dresses for their wives. It was isolating work, but it paid for her room and board, and left her with a few precious dollars at the end of the month. She had no family, no connections. Her parents had died of influenza on the trail west years ago, leaving her an orphan in a territory that had little patience for the unconnected. The trouble began with a bolt of expensive blue silk. It had been ordered by the mayor's wife, a rare luxury in the dusty town. Mrs. Davies had shown it to Abigail with a mixture of reverence and warning. "This costs more than you make in a month, girl," she'd said, her eyes narrow. "See that not so much as a thread is wasted." Abigail had nodded, treating the fabric as if it were spun glass. She cut the dress pattern with painstaking care, saving every scrap, as she always did. She was known for her thrift, her ability to make a child's quilt from remnants that others would have swept away. 2 days later, Mrs. Davies burst into the sewing room, her face a mask of crimson fury. "Where is it?" she shrieked, waving a ledger. "Where is what, Mrs. Davies?" Abigail asked, her foot stopping on the treadle. "The silk! The scraps! The ledger says 3 yards were cut, but the remnants aren't here. You stole them! You stole them to sell!" Abigail was stunned. I put them in the remnant bin, just as I always do. I would never—" "Liar!" Mrs. Davies pointed a trembling finger. "I knew it! I knew a girl like you, with no family, no roots, couldn't be trusted. You see something fine and you take it." It was useless to argue. Mr. Davies, a man who lived in his wife's considerable shadow, simply wrung his hands and muttered about the loss. Abigail's protests were drowned out by Mrs. Davies's accusations. She was fired on the spot, given 1 hour to pack her single bag, and paid only half of what she was owed. "Be grateful I don't call the sheriff," Mrs. Davies had spat, throwing the coins on the floor. As Abigail walked out of the store, the eyes of the townspeople felt like physical blows. The rumor had spread instantly. She was a thief. In a town where everyone depended on each other, it was a social death sentence. No one would hire her. No one would even sell her a loaf of bread. She had no choice but to leave. She bought a canteen of water and a small parcel of hardtack with the few coins she had. She had no idea where she was going. West was all she could think. Just walk until she was out of the shadow of the accusation. Now, sitting on the road, the dust caking her face and the sun beating down on her head, she realized the flaw in her plan. The prairie was not a place to walk. It was an ocean of grass and sky, and she was adrift in the middle of it. She had walked for a day and a half, the road stretching into an infinite wavering line. Her water was gone. Her feet were blistered and raw inside her thin boots. The despair was so total, so crushing, that the sound of the wagon had at first seemed like a hallucination. And then, the man's offer. "You need a roof, and I need a mother for my daughters. Come with me." It wasn't a question. It was a transaction. A desperate, raw bargain made between two people at the end of their respective ropes. Abigail looked at the 5 small, dirt-streaked faces in the wagon. The eldest, a girl of about 10, watched her with undisguised hostility. The others just looked curious, like small prairie dogs peeking from a burrow. A mother. The word was foreign. She was a seamstress, a loner. She knew nothing of children. But she also knew the alternative. The prairie night was coming, and with it, the coyotes. She had heard their yipping the night before, a sound that chilled her to the bone. I can cook, and I can clean, and I sew," she said, her voice hoarse. The man, Thomas, simply nodded. "That'll be enough. Get in." He didn't offer her a hand. He was a man of business, and this was a business deal. Abigail grasped the side of the wagon, her arms shaking with exhaustion, and hauled her aching body over the side. She landed heavily on the wooden boards, her suitcase clattering beside her. The wagon lurched forward. The girls pressed themselves against the far side, giving her space, all except the eldest, who continued to glare. Abigail simply sat, her head bowed, too exhausted to care. She had escaped the road. But as the wagon rumbled toward an unknown horizon, she had the terrible feeling she had just traded one prison for another. They rode for what felt like hours. The only sound, the rhythmic plodding of the horses and the creak of the wagon. The sun was a fiery red orb, dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The vast emptiness of the prairie was unsettling. Abigail was used to the close, cramped confines of the town. Here the sky was so big it felt like it could swallow a person whole. Finally, Thomas pointed. "There." Abigail squinted. In the deep twilight, she saw a shape against the skyline. It wasn't a house, so much as a dark block, a sod house carved into the earth, with a rickety wooden addition tacked onto the front. A single weak yellow light flickered in a window. As they drew closer, the reality of her new home settled in. The place was desolate. A few lean cows stood listlessly in a rope corral. The yard was bare, hard-packed dirt, save for a few skeletal dead sunflowers. A rusted plow lay on its side, looking as if it had been abandoned mid-furrow. There was no garden, no sign of life, save for the 5 silent children and the grim man driving the wagon. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. "We're home," he said, his voice flat. The girls scrambled out, disappearing into the darkness of the house like mice. Thomas lit a lantern hanging by the door, casting flickering, distorted shadows. "Your room is in the lean-to," he said, gesturing to the wooden addition. "It's small, but it's dry. The girls sleep in the loft. My room is in the back." He led her inside. The main room of the sod house was a kitchen and living space combined. It was filthy. The air was heavy with the smell of sour milk, smoke, and unwashed bodies. Dishes were piled in a dry sink, caked with old food. The floor was covered in dirt and unidentifiable grime. A cold, black wood-burning stove dominated one wall, its surface coated in grease. This was not just a house without a woman's touch. This was a house of profound despair. Thomas seemed to notice her expression in the lantern light. "It's gotten away from me," he muttered, a hint of shame in his voice. Clara, the eldest, she tries. But she's just a child. I understand, Abigail said, though she didn't. She couldn't imagine letting a place fall into such ruin. He showed her to her room. It was barely more than a closet, with a thin straw mattress on a crude wooden frame, a nail on the wall for her clothes, and a small, cracked wash basin. But as he had promised, it was dry, and the window, though small, looked out onto the prairie. It was more than she had an hour ago. The girls, Thomas said, rubbing the back of his neck. Their names. The eldest is Clara. She's 10. Then, Beth. She's 8. The twins, Sarah and Mary, are 6. And the youngest is Rose. She's 3. He paused, as if the names themselves were heavy. Their mother. She left 2 years ago. Couldn't take the life, the quiet. Just walked out one morning. Haven't seen her since. Abigail's heart, which she thought had been hardened by her own misfortunes, felt a small, sharp pang. Not a widower, a man abandoned, and 5 daughters left behind. It explained the hostility in Clara's eyes. It was the look of a child who had been forced to become an adult and who resented the entire world for it. "Is there anything for dinner?" Abigail asked, her stomach aching. Thomas looked at the disastrous kitchen. "There's cornmeal and some salt pork. I don't rightly know. I'll manage," Abigail said, unpinning her hat. She was a guest, an employee, a stray. She wasn't sure what her title was, but she knew her first duty. She took off her dusty traveling jacket and rolled up her sleeves. "First, I'll need a fire. And water. Where is the well?" "I'll fetch the water," Thomas said, seeming almost relieved to have a task. "The kindling is by the stove." As he left, Abigail stood alone in the center of the kitchen. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the faint sound of whispering from the loft above. She was in the middle of nowhere, in a stranger's house, responsible for 5 children who didn't want her there. She took a deep breath, the foul air filling her lungs. She walked to the stove and picked up the kindling. She would start with the fire, then the water, then the food. She would scrub the pans. She would scrub the floor. She would take this chaos, and she would, piece by piece, put it in order. It was the only thing she knew how to do. As she struck a match, the small flame illuminated her face. It was a face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes were set with a new, hard resolve. She had been hired to do a job, and if she was anything, Abigail was a person who finished what she started. The work was hard, but it was work, and work was something she understood. The first week was a war, fought on multiple fronts. The primary battle was against the filth. Abigail rose before the sun, her body aching, and began. She scrubbed the kitchen floor with lye soap until the wood grain, long hidden, reappeared. She boiled every dish, every pot, every piece of cutlery, scraping away years of neglect. She laundered the stiff, sour bedding, hanging it out in the relentless Kansas wind, which whipped her hair across her face but dried the sheets in an hour. The second battle was with the children. The younger ones, Rose, Sarah, and Mary, were easy. They were desperate for affection, for a soft touch, for a story. They began to orbit her like small, shy moons, watching her cook, watching her sew. Rose, the youngest, would silently appear at her side and hold up her hands, a silent plea to be held. Abigail, awkward at first, would lift the small, light child onto her hip, and the girl would rest her head on her shoulder, a small sigh of contentment escaping her. Beth, the 8-year-old, was quiet and observant, a shadow of her older sister. She watched Abigail, her eyes missing nothing, but offered no help and no hindrance. The true war was with Clara. The 10-year-old was a fortress of resentment. She had been the mother for 2 years, and she saw Abigail as a usurper, an interloper. "That's not how Papa likes his coffee," Clara would snap, as Abigail measured the grounds. "You're using the wrong pan for the cornbread," she'd say, her arms crossed. "Mama never hung the laundry that way. It'll stretch." Abigail held her tongue. She knew this was not about coffee or laundry. It was about a wound. A wound left by a mother who had walked away, and the scar tissue that had formed in her absence. Arguing would be pointless. So Abigail simply nodded. "Thank you for the advice, Clara. I'll remember that." Her calm agreement seemed to infuriate the girl more than any argument could have. Thomas was a ghost. He left before dawn to tend to his meager herd, to mend fences that seemed to fall apart as fast as he could fix them. He would return after dusk, eat the meal Abigail had prepared, a simple filling stew or beans and fresh-baked bread, in silence. He would eat quickly, his eyes on his plate. "Thank you, ma'am," he'd murmur, and then retreat to his room. Abigail realized that the man was as broken as his house. The shame of his wife's departure and his inability to cope had hollowed him out. He was just a shell, animated by the sheer necessity of survival. But slowly things began to change. The house stayed clean. The smell of baking bread replaced the stench of sour milk. Abigail, using the skills she had honed for years, began to mend. She patched the holes in the girls' dresses. She restitched the seams on Thomas's worn-out shirt. She took the fabric scraps she had been allowed to keep in her suitcase and sewed a soft doll for Rose, who had never owned one. One afternoon she found a patch of workable earth behind the house, near the well. She took the rusted plow blade and, using it as a hand trowel, began to dig. She turned the hard soil over, hour after hour, until her hands were blistered and bleeding. Thomas found her there at sunset, kneeling in the dirt. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough. "Making a garden," Abigail said, not looking up. "There's no reason to live on cornmeal and salt pork. We need greens, beans, squash." He watched her for a long moment. "The soil is hard. The wind'll take the seeds." "Not if I water it. Not if I cover the seedlings." He disappeared into the shed and returned with a hoe and a rake, their handles gray and splintered. "These might help," he said, and left them on the ground beside her. It was the first real conversation they'd had. That evening, as she was washing the dishes, Clara stormed into the kitchen. "You're wasting your time," the girl said, her voice sharp. "Mama tried to make a garden. It all died. Everything here dies." Abigail stopped scrubbing and turned to face the child. She was tired of the barbs. "Then it will die," Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I will have tried. It is better to try and fail, Clara, than to sit in the dirt and complain that it is dusty." Clara looked as if she'd been slapped. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came. She turned and fled up the ladder to the loft. Abigail sighed, turning back to the sink. She felt a twinge of guilt, but also a flash of satisfaction. The girl needed to understand that she was not a rival. Later that night, long after the house was dark, Abigail heard a small noise. She opened her door. Beth, the 8-year-old, was standing in the hallway in her nightgown. "What is it, Beth?" The girl was holding a small tin box. "Clara's crying," she whispered. She's a hard girl," Abigail said gently. "No, she's not," Beth whispered, stepping into the room. "She's just tired, like you were on the road." She held out the tin. "Mama left this. Clara kept it hidden. They're seeds." Abigail opened the small box. Inside were tiny, precious seeds carefully wrapped in twists of paper. Marigolds, beans, tomatoes. A memory of a woman who had, at one time, also dared to hope. She told me to give them to you," Beth whispered. She said you should plant them, so they don't die in the box." Abigail looked at the seeds, then at the small girl. It was an apology, a truce. Tell her thank you," Abigail said, her throat tight. "Tell her we'll plant them tomorrow, together." The planting of the seeds changed the house. Clara, her pride having forced her to offer the truce, now seemed bound to see it through. She and Beth worked alongside Abigail in the small garden plot every afternoon, hauling buckets of water from the well. Even Thomas, seeing their work, spent an evening reinforcing the fence around the plot to keep out the rabbits. A routine, once chaotic, now took on a gentle, predictable rhythm. Morning, Thomas and Abigail would be the first up. They would drink coffee in the quiet of the pre-dawn, a comfortable silence settling between them. He would talk, just a little, about the ranch, which cow was calving, where the fence line was weak. He was speaking to her as a partner, not an employee. Day, the girls, scrubbed clean and wearing mended dresses, would do chores, learn simple lessons from Abigail at the kitchen table, and tend the garden. The house was filled with the sounds of a home, the younger girls laughing, the sizzle of food in a pan, the rhythmic thump-thump of Abigail's sewing machine, which she had meticulously cleaned and oiled. Evening, the family would eat together. The food was better now. With the garden producing tender lettuces and early beans, their meals were fresh. After dinner, Thomas would sometimes read to the younger girls from a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, while Abigail and Clara cleaned the kitchen. The resentment in Clara's eyes had been replaced by a weary but genuine respect. One evening, Thomas came home with a bolt of yellow calico fabric. He placed it silently on the kitchen table. "What's this?" Abigail asked, touching the bright, cheerful cloth. "You've mended everything," he said gruffly. "The girls. They deserve something new. For the church social next month." Abigail looked at him, truly seeing the man behind the grief. He was kind. He was trying. "It's beautiful, Thomas," she said. "And this," he added, pulling a smaller parcel from his pocket. It was a skein of dark blue thread and 2 new needles. "For you, so you don't have to use your own." Abigail felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. "Thank you," she whispered. That night she couldn't sleep. She felt a sense of belonging that terrified her. She had come here for a roof, for survival. But she was building a life. She was beginning to care for this broken man and his 5 daughters. She was beginning to feel like a mother. The peace was shattered on a hot Tuesday in late July. Abigail was kneading dough, the kitchen filled with the scent of yeast. Rose was playing on the floor with her doll. The other girls were outside. A wagon rattled into the yard. It was not Thomas's. Abigail wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the door, shielding her eyes from the sun. A woman was climbing down from the wagon. She was pale and thin, but she had once been beautiful. She wore a city-style dress, though it was faded and dusty. Her blonde hair, the same color as the girls', was pinned up carelessly. The woman walked directly to the front door, her eyes sweeping over the clean porch, the blooming marigolds Abigail had planted by the steps, and finally landing on Abigail. There was a moment of frozen silence. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice a reedy whisper. "I'm Abigail," she replied, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, slow beat. "I'm the housekeeper." The woman gave a short, bitter laugh. "A housekeeper? Is that what he's calling you?" She pushed past Abigail into the kitchen. Her eyes darted around, taking in the clean floor, the rising bread, the scrubbed stove. "He's finally cleaned the place up," she muttered. Rose, seeing the stranger, scrambled to her feet and ran, hiding behind Abigail's skirts. The woman's eyes snapped down to the child. "Rose?" she whispered. "My, you're so big," she knelt, holding out a pale hand. "Rosie? It's me, it's Mama." Rose just pressed her face harder into Abigail's leg. The woman's face hardened. She stood up, her gaze turning cold as it landed back on Abigail. "So, you're the replacement." "I don't know what you mean," Abigail said, her hands gripping her apron. "Don't play dumb. the woman sneered. "I'm sure he told you all about me, the terrible wife, the one who ran away. Did he tell you why? Did he tell you about this God-forsaken empty land? This grave?" "He told me you left," Abigail said, her voice steady. "I did. I had to. I would have died here." She ran a hand through her hair. "But I'm back. The city, it wasn't what I thought. I'm back." "Why?" The word was out of Abigail's mouth before she could stop it. "Why?" The woman laughed again, a sound like breaking glass. "For them. For my daughters. For my husband. This is my home. My family." Just then, Clara and the other girls ran in from outside, chasing a chicken. "Abigail, the chicken got out." Clara stopped dead in the doorway. Her face went white. "Mama?" she whispered. The woman, whose name Abigail now knew must be Eleanor, turned. Her cold expression melted into one of a desperate, painful love. "Clara," she breathed. "Oh, my baby." Clara didn't move. She just stared, her hands clenched at her sides. "You're back," Clara said, her voice flat, dead. I'm back for good," Eleanor said, stepping toward her. "No," Clara said. The word was quiet, but it stopped Eleanor in her tracks. "You don't get to come back." "Clara, you left us." Clara's voice suddenly rose to a shriek, a sound of pure, primal agony that had been buried for 2 years. "You left us here? He stayed. We stayed. You left." "I was sick, baby." "We were sick too." Clara was sobbing now, great, tearing sobs. "And she pointed a shaking finger at Abigail. "She stayed. She cleaned up your mess. She planted your garden. She's our mother now." The words hung in the air, a declaration that changed everything. Abigail's blood ran cold. Eleanor's face contorted, first in pain, then in a cold, venomous rage. Her eyes locked on Abigail. You thief," Eleanor hissed. "You stole my children. You stole my life." "I stole nothing," Abigail said, finding her voice. "I was found on a road. I was given a job. I did the work you abandoned." Before anyone could move, Eleanor lunged. She didn't lunge at Clara. She lunged at Abigail. She grabbed the front of Abigail's dress, her fingernails digging in. "You'll leave," she screamed, her face inches from Abigail's. "Get out of my house." "This isn't your house," Clara screamed. "Stop it! Stop!" Beth was crying. Just then, the door banged open again. Thomas stood there, frozen, his face a mask of utter disbelief. "Eleanor?" Eleanor let go of Abigail, whipping around. "Thomas!" she cried, her rage melting instantly into a theatrical plea. "Thomas, thank God. Tell this woman to get out. I'm home. I'm finally home." Thomas just stared at her, then at the crying children, then at Abigail, who was standing, shaken, by the table. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, and, in a way, he had. The past he had tried to bury had just walked back through his front door. The kitchen was a tableau of frozen shock. Thomas's face was ashen. He looked at Eleanor as one would look at a specter, a nightmare given form. "What are you doing here, Eleanor?" He finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you, Thomas. I'm home," she said, trying to smooth her dress, to regain her composure. She attempted a smile, but it was a grimace. "I'm back for my family." "Our family," Thomas said, his voice hardening as the shock began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning anger. The family you left on a Tuesday morning with a note on the table saying, "I can't." The family that nearly starved. The family that Clara had to raise because I was too broken to see straight. "I was sick, Thomas," she insisted, the same defense she had used on Clara. "I told you, I was—" "And where did you go?" he interrupted, taking a step into the room. "To get better?" "I heard the talk. From your cousin in Baxter Springs. You went to St. Louis. You were living with a gambler. You weren't sick, Eleanor. You were bored." Eleanor flinched, the truth of his words striking home. He left me," she whispered. "He took everything. I had nowhere else to go. Thomas, this is my home. You're my husband. You have to take me back. The law says so." It was a trump card, and she knew it. They were still married. In the eyes of God and the law, she was the mistress of this house. Abigail felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Of course. She was the housekeeper, the hired help. She had no claim. She looked at the children. Clara was watching her father, her face pale with terror. Beth was crying silently. Rose was still clutching Abigail's dress. Abigail gently untangled Rose's hand and pushed her toward Beth. "Take her upstairs, girls," she said, her voice quiet. "Clara, take your sisters to the loft." "Now." "No," Clara said, planting her feet. "I'm staying. This is our home, not hers." "Clara, do as I say," Thomas ordered, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. "No," Clara shouted. "You tell her, Papa. Tell her she can't stay. Tell her we have a new mother." "Clara, be silent," Thomas warned, but the damage was done. Eleanor's gaze snapped back to Abigail, venom in her eyes. "So that's it. You've poisoned them against me. You've taken my place." "She didn't take anything," Clara cried. "We gave it to her, because she earned it. She didn't run away." "Enough!" Thomas roared. The word echoed in the small kitchen, silencing everyone. He walked slowly across the room until he was standing directly in front of his wife. He was taller than her, and the years of hard ranch work had made him solid, whereas she looked brittle, eaten away from the inside. "You're right, Eleanor," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You are my wife. The law does say that. But the law doesn't say a thing about a heart. You broke mine. You broke theirs." He gestured to the children. "You don't live here anymore. Your home is a memory. And it's one we're trying to forget. You can't just throw me out, Thomas," she cried, her confidence shattering, replaced by a raw panic. "Where will I go? I have nothing." "You had a home," he said. "You had 5 beautiful daughters. You had a husband who would have done anything for you, and you traded it all, because you were bored." He turned his back on her and walked to the kitchen cupboard. He took down a small cloth bag, the one where he kept the meager cash he earned from selling a calf. He untied it and emptied its contents onto the table, a few dollars, and a handful of coins. He pushed it across the table toward her. "This is all I have. It'll buy you a stagecoach ticket back to Baxter Springs, or wherever you came from. But you will not stay here. You will not spend one more night under this roof." Eleanor looked at the small pile of money, then at Thomas, her face a mask of disbelief. You're paying me to leave? My own home?" "This is not your home," he said. "A home is a place you build, a place you stay. You are just a stranger." A terrible, tearing sob escaped Eleanor. This was the finality. This was the end. It wasn't the passionate, angry fight she might have envisioned. It was a simple, cold transaction. The same way she had left, she was being dismissed. She looked at the children, at Clara, whose face was hard and unforgiving, at Beth, who was hiding her face, at the twins, who just looked confused, at Rose, who was peeking out from behind Abigail. Not one of them looked at her with love. Not one of them ran to her. She had come back for her family and had discovered her family no longer existed. Slowly, her shoulders slumped. The fight was gone. She scooped the money from the table, her hands shaking, and shoved it into her pocket. She walked to the door, her steps shuffling. She paused on the threshold and looked back. one last, desperate appeal in her eyes. "Thomas, go, Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went bone deep. She turned and walked to the wagon. They watched as she climbed in, clumsily handled the reins, and turned the wagon around. She disappeared in the same cloud of dust from which she had emerged. The kitchen was silent. No one moved. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Clara was the first to move. She ran to her father, not in triumph but in grief, burying her face in his waist. "She's gone," she wept. "She's gone, baby," he said, his hand stroking her hair. "She's really gone." Abigail stood by the table, her heart pounding. She felt like an intruder on this private, painful moment. She began to back away, to retreat to her room. "Abigail," Thomas's voice stopped her. She turned. He was still holding Clara, but he was looking at her. His eyes were clear for the first time. The grief, the shame, the ghost he'd been living with for 2 years, it had all been confronted and exorcised. "Don't go," he said. It wasn't an order, it was a plea. Clara looked up, her face tear-streaked. She let go of her father and, in a move that shocked Abigail to her core, she ran and grabbed Abigail's hand. "Don't go," Clara echoed, her grip desperate. "You're home. This is your home." The other girls, seeing Clara's signal, rushed forward, surrounding Abigail, their small hands grabbing her dress, her apron, her hands. "Don't leave, Abigail. Stay with us. We love you." Abigail looked down at the children, then up at Thomas, who was watching her with a raw, hopeful vulnerability that matched his daughter's. Tears she hadn't even known she was holding back began to stream down her face. She wasn't a stray. She wasn't an employee. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, sinking to her knees to embrace the children. "I'm home." Life on the prairie is not marked by grand events, but by the slow, steady turning of the seasons. The departure of Eleanor was not an end, but a beginning. The family, which had been cobbled together by necessity and grief, now began to truly heal, forged by choice. Thomas and Abigail were married a year later, not in a church but in the yard, standing on the soil of the garden they had built together. The preacher from a neighboring county officiated. The 5 girls, dressed in identical yellow calico dresses that Abigail had sewn, stood as their witnesses. It was not a marriage born of youthful passion, but something stronger, a partnership built from shared work, mutual respect, and a quiet, unshakable love. The ranch, under their combined efforts, began to prosper. Thomas, with Abigail's clear-headed sense for numbers, secured a small loan from the bank in Baxter Springs. He bought a new plow, a better bull, and 20 new head of cattle. The sod house was slowly encased in a proper wooden frame, and a real porch was added, where Abigail and the girls would sit in the evenings. The girls grew. Clara, her hardness softened by security and love, became the ranch's fierce protector, her father's right hand. She had his head for numbers and her mother's fire, but it was tempered by Abigail's steady patience. Beth, always quiet, became the family's artist, sketching the vast prairie landscapes on any scrap of paper she could find. The twins, Sarah and Mary, were the social heart of the family, inseparable and cheerful. And Rose, the child who had hidden behind Abigail's skirts, grew into a confident, loving young woman. Her mother's memory, nothing more than a faint, curious story. One winter, nearly 10 years after Abigail had first arrived, a letter came. It was from a hospital in St. Louis. Eleanor had passed away from consumption, alone and in poverty. Thomas read the letter, his face grim, and then passed it to Abigail. She read it, and felt only a quiet sadness for the woman who had been given so much and had chosen so little. That night, Thomas sat with Clara, now a young woman of 20, and told her. Clara was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. "It's sad," she said finally. "It's sad that she never found what she was looking for." She looked at Thomas, and then at Abigail, who was sitting across the room, rocking the new baby, Thomas and Abigail's son, to sleep. "I'm just so grateful," Clara whispered. "That we did." Years later, Abigail, now a grandmother herself, would sit on that wide front porch, watching her grandchildren play in the same yard she had once thought so desolate. Thomas, his hair white, would sit beside her, his hand resting on hers. Their life had not been easy. There had been droughts, blizzards, and losses. The prairie was a hard master. But it had given her everything. She had come to this place with nothing but a false accusation and a battered suitcase. She had been offered a roof, a bargain born of desperation, and in this empty, unforgiving land, she had found something she never even knew she was looking for. She had found a home. She had found her family. Thank you for joining Old World Whispers for this journey back to the Kansas frontier. The past is filled with stories of incredible resilience, of people who, faced with impossible choices, found the strength to build a new life from the ashes of the old. Abigail's story is a reminder that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you fight to build. If you were moved by her story, please consider subscribing to our channel and becoming part of our community. We have so many more whispers from the old world to share with you. Click the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We look forward to seeing you again.